In 1637, three godly men made their way under a heavily armed guard through the streets of London. In pamphlets and speeches, these men had argued against changes to the Protestant Church of England. They were now to be punished, not by another faith or church, but by their own fellow Protestants. For their stand, they were branded as seditious libelers, and then had their ears cut off. In this atmosphere of intense religious feeling, England was becoming divided. Soon the passionate beliefs of both sides would ignite civil war. I'm going to take you on a journey into the Civil War, one of the darkest, bloodiest episodes in our history. This is not just a story of Roundheads and Cavaliers, Charles I and Oliver Cromwell, but a time of great political upheaval and radical ideas. As a historian, it's a time I'm fascinated by, because it's left a legacy that still marks us today.
360 years ago, people were persecuted for their beliefs and died for their religion. It was a time of strong but conflicting faiths that dragged England, Ireland and Scotland into a decade of bloody conflict. Hundreds of thousands were killed while these islands were torn apart in a savage civil war. Most people think of this period as the English Civil War. It was in fact a war which engulfed all of Britain and Ireland, and it was part of a European crisis which made its way onto these shores. And what sparked that crisis was religion.
At the head of the church and at the heart of the Civil War stood King Charles I. Charles didn't willfully cause the war, but it's hard to imagine how it could have happened without this vain and self-righteous man. But following the earlier death of his talented brother, the shy and stammering Charles was crowned in 1625. Yet he had little of the character required to be king. Over the next 10 years, he plunged England, Ireland and Scotland into a bloody conflict, causing the greatest loss of life prior to World War I. So how did Charles turn his three peaceful kingdoms into a war zone? I think it was Charles's combination of naivety and arrogance that were the key. At every turn, every twist in the chaos of the Civil War, he made the wrong choice at the wrong time.
Charles's father, James I, believed in the sanctity of monarchy, that his right to rule was God-given. But he also had the skills of a politician. He knew you had to cut deals to get what you want. Charles, on the other hand, just didn't get it. He believed in the sanctity of monarchy, but that was it. As a king, he didn't feel the need to make deals, and instead he demanded blind obedience. Someone of the time wrote of him, he was the most obstinate person in his self-will that ever was, that he was resolved either to be such a king or none. So without any of his father's political acumen, Charles's arrogance was going to bring him a world of pain.
The first signs of trouble came in the church as Charles I, a deeply religious man, introduced controversial changes. In the Reformation, 100 years earlier, Henry VIII split England from the Roman Catholic Church, and the Protestant Church of England was born.
And that's what we have here, a Church of England moulded together as the mushy political compromise we know today, with the monarch as supreme head. But during the 1630s, in Charles's reign, the church began to be pulled apart by two competing factions, each wanting to drag the church towards what they believed in.
Man hath no power over death, nor deliverance from battle. There is no
On one
power
side were the Puritans, a devout and serious people devoted to the Bible. They wanted a purer, simpler church with much less emphasis on ceremonies and hierarchy. On the other side was King Charles and his high church followers, who revered the sacraments and rituals. They wanted a more important, more ceremonial role for the clergy. The man who carried out the king's reforms was William Laud, his Archbishop of Canterbury. Laud was an obnoxious but spiritual man. Together, he and the king began to transform the way the Protestant faith was practiced in England. Resentment grew in many parishes as radical changes were made to their religious services.
At that time, the parish church stood at the heart of the community. Everyone had to attend, and here they gossiped, worshipped, and received official news from the government. The church was absolutely fundamental to their lives. Today, Britain is effectively a secular state, with hundreds of faiths, but arguably no true national religion to speak of. But in the 17th century, men were willing to lay down their lives for their vision of the church.
The supporters of Archbishop Laud ruthlessly enforced his changes to the church, promoting allies and persecuting opponents. Some Puritans were beaten, others even tortured. They felt Archbishop Laud was betraying the Protestant cause.
At the heart of the struggle was the communion table.
It's amazing that a piece of furniture could incite such anger. The Puritans wanted the table left amongst the congregation to emphasize the individual's personal relationship with God. Archbishop Laud wanted it moved to the east and symbolically railed off from the worshippers. This distance would underline the clergy's superiority.
Sometimes, like here at St Mary's Deerhurst in Gloucestershire, they simply moved the communion table 90 degrees from east to west to north to south to emphasize the authority of the vicar over the congregation.
Archbishop Laud also introduced stained glass windows and other icons.
These were small but highly significant, highly inflammatory moves.
To the Puritans, Laud's reforms were a declaration of war. In their eyes, the Archbishop was taking the Church of England back to Catholicism. The Puritans were so anxious because across Europe, the Protestant religion was fighting for its very survival.
By the time of Charles's reign, the whole of Europe was engaged in what was later known as the 30 Years' War. No nation escaped as Protestant and Catholic forces tried to settle 100 years of religious difference.
Like the Cold War between capitalism and communism, 17th century Europe was split between two opposing ideologies. But Catholicism was winning, cutting the area controlled by Protestants from one half of Europe to one-fifth.
England was terrified by the growing Catholic menace. Since Queen Elizabeth and the Spanish Armada, English identity had cemented around anti-Catholicism, similar to anti-communism in post-war America. And just as the Americans were obsessed by communist infiltrators, so 17th century England had a deep paranoia about popish plots.
England feared the politics as much as the religion of Catholicism. The Catholic countries of Europe seemed always to be governed by authoritarian, absolute monarchs. And that's what terrified English Protestants. They worried that the king's reforms to the Church of England meant that Charles himself had been seduced by Catholicism. If that wasn't proof enough, he was also sleeping with the enemy. His French wife, Queen Henrietta Maria, was a Roman Catholic. Like Charles, she believed in the absolute power of kings and only bolstered Charles's arrogance. She was deeply unpopular throughout Protestant England. But the so-called English Civil War didn't even begin in England. The Civil War began in Edinburgh, Scotland's capital. Like his father, King James, Charles I was the King of England, Ireland, and of Scotland.
The three kingdoms operated like snooker balls on a table, nudging and knocking each other. One ball, one kingdom, could easily smash apart the carefully laid plans of the other two.
It took all of James I's diplomatic skills to rule these three separate countries.
Instead, Charles, with an unshakable belief in his own powers, thought he could rule three kingdoms as one country. The first to feel the impact of his one-country policy was Scotland.
Most Scots belonged to the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, which practiced a simpler and more democratic form of worship than the Church of England. Their beliefs were similar to the Puritans and clashed fundamentally with those of King Charles.
Both Charles and Archbishop Laud resented the independence of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. They wanted to bring churches like this one, St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, more into line with the Laudian Church of England. Charles aimed to overhaul its practices and, most significantly, its prayer book.
Charles challenged Scottish independence by imposing his new prayer book on their church. The irony was that even though Charles himself was a committed Protestant, the Presbyterian Scots saw the prayer book as a Catholic takeover and were appalled.
The Scottish people didn't take to the new prayer book, and to be frank, they didn't take to Charles either. In July 1637, the new service was begun here at St Giles. It was a grand gathering with all the church establishment lined up. But as soon as the dean began the service from the pulpit, he was shouted down by a chorus of women. They screamed, "The Mass is come amongst us," and started hurling Bibles and stools at the astonished dean and bishops.
Across Scotland, churchgoers reacted with fury to the new service. A minister was almost torn to pieces when he read from the new prayer book. One bishop was so scared of his congregation, he armed himself with a pair of loaded pistols. But it was in another Edinburgh church, Greyfriars Kirk, where this violent protest was shaped into a national movement.
Holy Spirit of God, unite us in one offering of faith and hope and love, now and forever. Amen.
Across Scotland, antagonism towards the prayer book hardened into rebellion. It was led by a Scottish nobility deeply hostile to Charles. They didn't like his manner, how he ignored them at his court in London.
Above all, though, they feared Charles would give their land away to his supporters in Scotland.
Opposition to the prayer book provided the perfect excuse to teach Charles a lesson. Meeting together at Greyfriars Kirk, just a couple of hundred yards from St Giles, the Scottish nobles drew up the National Covenant, setting out the nation's grievances. It travelled the length and breadth of Scotland, and any Scot who had a grudge against Charles I and his government signed up. It was highly popular. The Covenant was a document to Scottish national pride, a testament to their desire for home rule free from Whitehall. The rebels became known as Covenanters. The Earl of Argyll quickly emerged as leader of the Covenanters. Chief of the great Campbell clan, Argyll was the most powerful nobleman in Scotland. He was utterly charmless, but highly intelligent and committed to his cause. As a devout Presbyterian, he had nothing but contempt for the Laudian popery of Charles I and the Anglican Church. Argyll believed utterly in his own rightness, that God had marked him out for great things.
To the king, the Scottish Covenanters were nothing more than terrorists, whose hidden agenda was to remove him from power. He was determined to crush this rebellion, but without a standing army of his own, Charles was forced to turn to England's leading noblemen for help. But many were reluctant to wage a war against their fellow Protestants in Scotland. But in Scotland, the Covenanters were ready to fight. They felt it was the only way to protect their religion from the king. As a result, they quickly mobilised a large and highly motivated army.
Charles moved fast to crush the Covenanters. He urged his supporters in the northeast of Scotland to rise up. He authorised an army of 5,000 Irish troops to attack Argyll in the Western Highlands. And he planned for an invasionary force to sail up the east coast and land alongside the Firth of Forth.
Charles himself marched his army up to Berwick-upon-Tweed, ready to join his royalist supporters north of the border.
But the Covenanters weren't waiting around to be invaded. They suppressed the royalist uprising in Scotland and then headed south to confront the king at Berwick. Here at Berwick, near where Scotland and England meet, the two armies faced each other across the River Tweed. On the one side were camped the Covenanting forces, chanting psalms and listening to sermons. On the other side was Charles's confused and demoralised army with little stomach for the fight. But there was one amongst them who was rather more keen to take on the Covenanters. Thomas Winderbank, one of Charles's officers, explained how he was keeping himself warm with the idea of rubbing, fubbing and scrubbing those scurvy, villainous, filthy, lousy, lying, shitten, bestial, impertinent, damnable, puritanical crew of the Scottish Covenant. Both sides squared up, but before any battle was fought, Charles surrendered. The troops from Ireland had never arrived, and the invasionary force sailed up and down the Firth of Forth without landing. All that was left was Charles's inadequate army. Sensing the hopelessness of his position, Charles called it a day and agreed to Covenanter demands to come to Scotland and listen to their grievances.
But for Charles, this was by no means the end of it. As far as he was concerned, kings didn't cut deals with their subjects. Almost at once, he was planning a fresh offensive against the rebels.
Charles's army failed to beat the Covenanters at Berwick because it was so poorly resourced. The king simply didn't have enough money to fight a war. If Charles was going to take on the Covenanters again, he needed a cash injection, and that meant recalling Parliament. So he did just that, announcing elections for a new Parliament for April 1640. Across the country, MPs set off from their constituencies to travel down to Westminster. This was a tremendous gamble for the king. Throughout the 1630s, Charles had governed by himself with no restraint from the House of Commons. Some condemned this as a tyranny, but it was not that unusual. Both Elizabeth I and James I had ruled for years without parliaments. Generally, parliaments were only called when monarchs needed money or wider political support. But for Charles, in this increasingly hostile political climate, recalling Parliament was like opening Pandora's box. The Parliament of the 1640s was very different to the one we know now. No Prime Minister's question time, no highly organised parties, certainly no leader of the opposition. All MPs and lords were assumed to be loyal to the Crown. Yet there were factions or groups within the House of Commons. And in the 1640 Parliament, there was a clear split between those MPs who strongly supported the king, many of whom were ministers in Charles's administration, and an unofficial opposition group who were driven by their religious ideals.
These Puritans found themselves increasingly at odds with the king. For the last 11 years, the king had ruled England without Parliament. He had kept himself afloat through forced loans and a variety of underhand taxes, none of which gave him enough money to fight a war, and all of which were deeply unpopular. These taxes, unsanctioned by Parliament, infuriated the wealthy political classes, many of whom sat in the House of Commons. Many MPs were reluctant to hand over a blank cheque to the king. Parliament wanted something in return, namely a more Puritan Church of England and an end to arbitrary taxation. If the king thought Westminster would simply hand over the cash for a second war against the Scottish Covenanters, he was in for a shock.
After 3 weeks of bad-tempered debate, it became clear Charles wasn't going to get the money he needed. So he pulled the plug and dissolved what became known as the Short Parliament. The king retreated back a few hundred yards up to his palace at Whitehall to think again.
In his hour of need, Charles turned to a trusted ally, the Earl of Strafford. The gout-ridden Strafford had made his name as the king's bully boy in Ireland. As Lord Deputy, he had ruled Ireland with an iron fist, brutally suppressing any opposition to the king's authority. Strafford's advice was clear. First, don't negotiate with Parliament. Second, crush the Scottish Covenanters. To back this up, he promised 10,000 troops from Ireland. Encouraged by Strafford's warmongering and promise of troops, Charles marched back up to Scotland. But informed by their Puritan allies in Parliament of the king's plans, the Scottish Covenanters seized the initiative. They crossed the border, marched south, and within 10 days captured Newcastle. This blitzkrieg was a disaster for the king. Hopelessly outmaneuvered, Charles had no choice but to sign another humiliating treaty with the Covenanters. In the face of this emergency, the king was under tremendous pressure to recall Parliament once again.
Charles had reluctantly called the First Parliament to raise money to fight the Scottish Covenanters. Now, with the Covenanter forces occupying northern England, Charles was forced to return to Westminster from his palace in Whitehall for another opening of Parliament. But this time, it was a Parliament over which he would have even less control.
Opposition to the king in Parliament was led by John Pym, a West Country lawyer with intense Puritan beliefs. Pym was a formidable political strategist.
We must see to him and try and change his.
Following the king's disastrous campaign against the Covenanters, Pym knew Charles was in a weakened position. But there was no way Pym could attack the king directly, so instead he used Parliament to hound Charles's closest advisors. When the House of Commons reconvened, Pym attacked Archbishop Laud, but he was really after Charles's right-hand man, the Earl of Strafford.
Within a week of Parliament's opening session, Pym persuaded the House of Commons to impeach Strafford for treason, for attempting to import an Irish army to crush the Scots. Pym alleged that this force would then be used against Parliament itself. Although many MPs were sceptical of Pym's claims, they thought that if they could only rid Charles of these evil advisors, men such as Strafford and Laud, then everything would be all right.
The trial was politically motivated, the evidence weak, and the case against Strafford collapsed. Desperate for a conviction, Pym then abandoned the trial and introduced an Act of Attainder. This was a parliamentary bill which simply declared Strafford a traitor. Constitutionally, the Commons were now on very shaky ground. The King had stood by Strafford throughout his trial, but with Parliament ranged against him and London mobs now screaming for blood, Charles cracked and signed Strafford's death warrant. In a moment of weakness, the King sacrificed his closest ally in the hope of pacifying Parliament. It was a decision Charles was always to regret. When he received the news of his fate, Strafford remarked, "Put not your trust in princes, nor in the sons of men, for in them there is no salvation." On the 12th of May 1641, Strafford was beheaded as a traitor to his king and country. After Strafford's execution, the troubled relationship between king and parliament began to settle. England seemed to be at peace again, and so Charles could return to his favourite pastime of playing bowls.
To smooth out his remaining differences with the Scottish Covenanters, in August 1641, Charles journeyed up to Edinburgh. Civil war, let alone a republic, was just not on the radar.
Charles felt he was back in control of England and Scotland, but it was events in his third kingdom, Ireland, which were about to shatter this illusion of peace.
In November 1641, hysterical reports swamped London of a fully fledged Irish rebellion. News filtered through of a Protestant Holocaust, of settlers butchered, of infants ripped from the womb, of rape and terrible ethnic cleansing. The full horror of the war in Europe between Catholic and Protestant had finally hit Charles's three kingdoms. The Catholic conspiracy, so long feared and so painfully imagined, had finally happened.
The tension in Charles's three kingdoms was about to explode. England, Ireland and Scotland now stood on the verge of a bloody abyss. In the winter of 1641, Protestant settlers in Ireland were savagely attacked by their Catholic neighbours. At Portadown in Ulster, the Protestants were stripped bare and thrown into the freezing waters of the River Bann. Those who tried to swim to the riverbank were bludgeoned or shot. Almost 100 Protestant men, women and children were condemned to an icy grave. Civil war had now hit Ireland.
The bloodbath of 1641, part of which took place here at the River Bann, blew apart the uneasy peace between King and Parliament, between England, Scotland and Ireland, and between Catholic and Protestant. The Portadown massacre is still part of the memory of Ulster. The troubles of the 1640s are part of today's troubles. The events here started a decade of bloody conflict which pitted English, Irish and Scottish against each other and against themselves.
By 1641, relations between Scotland and England had settled down after King Charles I had narrowly avoided a full-scale war with the Scots. Charles's attempt to impose his religious agenda had alienated most of the Scottish people, as well as the Puritan faction in Parliament. They feared their Protestant religion was being undermined by Charles and had forced the king to back down. But in Ireland, the Protestant faith was facing a far more deadly threat. The roots of the Irish Rebellion go back to the early 1600s, when English and Scottish Protestants were settled in Ireland by Charles's father, James I, to help exert royal authority over Catholic Ireland.
Behind me are the Loyal Orange Lodges, assembled here to commemorate their past. Among these Orange men are probably direct descendants of the Protestant settlers introduced by James I. And the religious fault lines, which began then between Protestant and Catholic, continue to this day.
During the 17th century, the Protestant settlers occupied some of the most fertile areas of Ireland. In a policy of forced migration, they pushed the native population onto barren land. As the Catholic Irish faced extreme poverty, they began to feel as if their very existence was under threat.
By the late 1630s, relations between the Protestant settlers and the Irish Catholics were at breaking point. The problem was their king, Charles I, was king not only of Ireland, but also of Scotland and England. And the more Charles seemed to placate Protestants in Scotland and England, the more the Catholics in Ireland became fearful. In the end, they saw no way out but rebellion.
Across Ireland, over 12,000 Protestants were killed. As other settlers began to fight back, Ireland became the Balkans of the 17th century. The sectarian divisions which began then continue to this day. Every year, razor wire and barricades are erected at Drumcree Church just outside Portadown to prevent the ritual march of Protestant Orangemen through Catholic neighbourhoods.
You don't have to be here long to feel the sheer weight of the past. And you don't need to be here at all to read the papers or see the TV images to understand that the Irish Rebellion began a series of divisions which still scar communities like this one.
In a desperate bid to escape the violence, thousands of terrified Protestant settlers boarded ships bound for the English mainland. As they crossed the Irish Sea, they carried with them terrible stories of bloodshed. At a time of information confusion, with no UN observers or 24-hour media, they escalated with each account.
Cheap tracts and woodcuts gloried in every bloody tale of torture and mutilation. Truly gruesome stories of skin stripped from bones and babies ripped from wombs fed the anti-Catholic hysteria. Such was the frenzy that one educated MP put the number of dead at over 200,000.
These vastly exaggerated figures of Protestant dead sparked fears of a Catholic uprising across England. In London, the Irish Rebellion unleashed a blind panic that only intensified the antagonism between King and Parliament. Charles demanded Parliament give him the money for an army to crush the Irish Catholics. But the King had made many enemies in Westminster, and none more so than John Pym, the leader of the Puritans in the House of Commons.
See to him and try and change his mind.
Pym blocked all moves to help the King. He argued that if Charles got hold of an army, he might well use it to crush dissent in Parliament. Instead, Pym urged the House of Commons to issue a grand remonstrance attacking the King. This damning document listed all of Parliament's religious and political grievances. It was a momentous assault on the royal prerogative at a time of crisis, and only hardened Charles's contempt for the parliamentarians. But the Puritans in Parliament had their sights on a Catholic threat much closer to home than Ireland. As a committed Roman Catholic, Charles's wife, Queen Henrietta Maria, was despised by the Puritans. Pym feared she had a dangerous influence over the king. He even accused her of supporting the Catholic rebellion in Ireland. When rumours began to circulate that the House of Commons might impeach the Queen, she demanded Charles take action.
On January the 4th, 1642, Charles marched out of Whitehall Palace with 400 armed guards to storm Westminster.
Charles burst into the chamber and demanded of the Speaker of the House, "Is Mr. Pym here?" The Speaker refused to answer and instead replied, "I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak, except as this House is pleased to direct me." "No matter," said Charles as he scanned the empty chamber. "I see all the birds have flown."
Pym had learnt of Charles's approach. Together with his accomplices, he slipped out of the House of Commons, along the corridors of Westminster, and onto a barge waiting to take them downriver. Charles pursued Pym and the fugitives deep into the city, but the king was confronted by an angry mob. The people of London were turning against him. Charles was terrified. In a panic, he gathered together his wife and children and fled the capital. When they arrived at Hampton Court in the dead of night, nothing had been prepared. The royal family slept together in an unmade bed. The king's botched attempt to arrest Pym was calamitous. To many MPs, Charles had behaved like a tyrant. There now seemed an insurmountable gulf between king and Parliament. Charles would never again see London as a free man. Back in Ireland, the Catholic rebellion had now escalated into a full-blown civil war. Fighting intensified as thousands of Scottish and English Protestants arrived to defend the embattled settler communities. The Catholics had formed a confederation, and after a string of victories were now demanding self-government and full religious toleration. The leader of the Irish Confederates, Owen Roe O'Neill, was an inspirational figure who had spent the previous 20 years fighting for Catholicism on the European mainland. Using hit-and-run guerrilla tactics, O'Neill subjected the Protestant communities to a brutal campaign of burning, looting and killing.
With the king gone and news of Catholic victories in Ireland, London descended into anarchy. Barricades and chains went up across the streets, while rumours of plots and invasions circulated wildly. In this highly charged atmosphere, Parliament gained the support of the London apprentices. They milled round Westminster, attacking anyone suspected of Catholic or royalist sympathies. It was the hair of the apprentices, or rather lack of it, that earned the parliamentarians their nickname. Because of their short-haired, bullet-headed appearance, they became ridiculed as Roundheads. They were the skinheads of the Civil War.
What we say when we admit to the Lord that we are sinners and we need his forgiveness. The time
The Roundheads were fired up by lurid readings from the Book of Revelations and prophecies of damnation. They genuinely believed Charles was the victim of a Catholic plot which had turned him against his own people. So the order given to the Roundhead generals was not to kill the king, but to rescue him from his evil, popish advisors.
As the Parliamentarians became known as Roundheads, so the Royalists gained the title of Cavaliers. This had nothing to do with the length of their hair, but was another term of abuse, alluding to the Cavaliero or Spanish trooper. The Spanish army was Europe's most militant fighter for Catholicism, so Cavalier meant oppressor of the Protestant cause. Most Cavaliers were not passionate defenders of Charles, but they were willing to fight to defend the Church of England from Puritan extremists.
Look to your arms! With haste, gentlemen!
The two sides were now involved in a furious race to raise and equip an army. Fighting men across England were ordered by both sides to rally to their cause. King and Parliament issued competing demands for loyalty, and the country grudgingly divided into Roundheads and Cavaliers. Every man was forced to choose a side in a war few wanted and many feared.
The terrible brutality of civil wars lies in their ability to set communities, even families, against each other. As the modern conflict in the Balkans has shown, there is little more destructive than a nation fighting itself. For huge numbers, the very idea of rebelling against the monarch was just too awful to contemplate. Since their earliest days at church, the English had been taught the homily of obedience. The authority of kings, it said, our ordinance is not of man, but of God. We may not resist, nor in any ways hurt, an anointed king.
Negotiations between the two sides collapsed. On August 22nd, 1642, King Charles I made an unprecedented move. For the first and last time in English history, a king officially declared war against his own parliament. On a windswept hill outside the strategically vital town of Nottingham, the king's royal standard was unfurled in front of a small group of loyal followers. Parliament and all who supported the Roundheads were denounced as traitors.
England was becoming slowly divided up between royalist and parliamentarian sympathisers. Generally, the West and the North were for the king, while the South and the East were for Parliament. The areas with stronger support for Parliament were those with a history of Puritanism, such as Essex and East Anglia, as well as the commercial centres of London and Bristol. Elsewhere, the king enjoyed broad support, especially in more rural, traditional communities, where Puritanism hadn't gained such a foothold.
Charles set out to reclaim his capital in October 1642. However, the Roundheads were desperate to prevent the Cavaliers from reaching London. It was only a matter of time before the two armies came face to face. The pin-up boy of the Cavalier army was Charles's nephew, Prince Rupert of the Rhine. At 23, he was a charismatic and highly skilled cavalry commander. He had fought with great distinction in the religious wars which were raging on the continent. Rupert saw Parliament's rebellion as a personal affront to his uncle and his family. He was determined to crush it. The Roundhead army was commanded by the less glamorous Earl of Essex. He too was a veteran of the wars on the continent, but as a Puritan and critic of Charles, Essex had chosen to back Parliament.
The two armies were to meet here for the first encounter. The first time Englishmen had fought Englishmen since the Wars of the Roses 200 years earlier. On the road from Kinnerton to Banbury, in the heart of England, they met at this dramatic escarpment known as Edge Hill. Diplomacy finally collapsed as King and Parliament went to war over their competing visions of church and state. When Essex arrived at Edge Hill, he discovered the Cavaliers had taken the high ground. He looked up to see an army of 13,000 men, a sea of 15-foot pike, thousands of armed cavalry with swords and pistols, cannons positioned and lines of musketeers. At the top of the escarpment, Charles, dressed in a black velvet cloak, rode along the lines offering encouragement. Your king is your cause, your quarrel and your captain.
At 3 p.m, Essex gave the order for his artillery to open fire. The Cavaliers immediately responded. As the battle began, one of the Cavalier commanders offered up a prayer.
O Lord, thou knowest how busy I must be this day. If I forget thee, do not thou forget me. And then Rupert charged. His cavalry rode tight together, hoping to smash the Roundhead forces with the first impact of their charge. They came in hard on the angle, firing at the stunned Roundhead infantry, who turned and fled. With that, the Royalist infantry commander Astley shouted, "March on, boys!" And the Cavalier foot, armed with their vast pikes, plunged them into the Roundheads. But Rupert's enthusiasm got the better of him. His cavalry pursued fleeing soldiers and, instead of returning to the battle, plundered baggage trains deep behind enemy lines. The Cavalier foot soldiers were left without cover.
The Earl of Essex had cleverly kept 2 regiments of cavalry in reserve. With Rupert gone, they ploughed into the Cavaliers, and for the first time, the Roundheads sensed they might win. But the Cavalier artillery fought back with a hail of shot and halted the Roundheads' advance. Now completely exhausted, neither army was capable of making a breakthrough, and as darkness descended, they both retired. As morning broke, the human cost of the Civil War was all too apparent. Women scoured the battlefield, hoping to find a lost husband or son. Others stripped the dead of any valuable items. In wartime, even a pair of boots made a fine prize. Hundreds of men on both sides had been killed, over 1,500 in total. Neither side was keen to renew the action.
The Battle of Edge Hill was an unsatisfactory draw, but crucially, Essex had failed to stop the king, and the way was now open for Charles to march on London. Taking Banbury, Oxford and Reading, Charles and Rupert soon had an anxious Parliament in their sights. But when they reached the modern-day London suburb of Turnham Green, the tired Royalists were faced by 20,000 armed militia who had come out to defend the city. Charles and Rupert thought better of taking on such a force and retreated back to Oxford.
As winter drew in, both sides halted the conflict. Harsh weather conditions made it impossible to move their vast armies around the country.
Charles chose Oxford as his headquarters. With its tradition of conservatism and support for Archbishop Laud's religious reforms, the king felt at home here. Oxford's magnificent colleges provided exactly the right setting for the king and his entourage to set up Charles's wartime court. Anyone who was anyone fled Puritan London and headed down to Oxford. Charles lived at Christ Church College. New College became the principal armoury, and Rupert based himself at Magdalen. University life was turned upside down as livestock were penned in quads and college silver was melted down to fund the high living. Charles was having a ball and rewarded his followers with a shower of university honours. He awarded 18 doctors and 48 bachelors of divinity, 5 doctors and 8 bachelors of physics, 34 doctors and 14 bachelors of civil law, 76 MAs and 12 BAs, until, that is, the university asked him to stop.
The king reserved his generous mood for his supporters. When the Roundheads offered terms for a settlement, he treated them with contempt.
There are 3 things, Charles told them, I will not part with. The church, my crown, and my friends, and you will have much ado to get them from me. No one had expected a stalemate. The battle at Edgehill was meant to resolve the dispute between king and parliament. While both sides remained confident of victory, neither seemed interested in a settlement. For the country at large, this was the worst of all worlds.
While the Cavaliers lived it up in Oxford, the Roundheads started destroying all physical signs of Charles's reforms to the Church of England. Puritan preachers denounced the king for corrupting the Protestant faith with popish affectations.
Stained glass windows, fonts, rails, statues, even communion tables were damaged by billeted soldiers and also deliberately destroyed as symbols of popery and idolatry. Worcester was hit the worst. It was described by one Roundhead soldier as so vile, papistical and abominable that it resembles Sodom and is the very emblem of Gomorrah.
Early in 1643, the civil war in England kicked off again. The Royalist Cavaliers swept through the west of England, and by July they had captured the Roundhead stronghold of Bristol.
Despite Charles's great successes in the west, there was still no decisive breakthrough. Both sides now looked for outside reinforcements.
The Civil War was never an entirely English affair. Ireland and Scotland were always part of the conflict. And in 1643, Charles turned to the Catholics of Ireland for help. He cut a peace deal with Owen Roe O'Neill, leader of the Confederate rebels.
In return for Charles agreeing to repeal anti-Catholic laws and to grant the Irish greater political independence, the Confederates they'd not only agreed to a ceasefire, but they'd also helped the Cavaliers with troops and arms.
The ceasefire in Ireland also freed thousands of English troops who returned home to fight for the king. But there was a price.
By agreeing to negotiate with the Confederates, Charles was seen to have cut a deal with the devil. It was a betrayal of the entire English nation. He had sold his soul to the very people who slaughtered innocent Protestants at Portadown during the 1641 rebellion, all to help crush his own people.
With reinforcements from Ireland, the Cavaliers made steady gains in the northwest of England. There was now a real danger of the Roundheads losing the war. So Parliament's leader, John Pym, though racked with cancer, started secret negotiations with Scottish Protestants. On the 25th of September, 1643, they united together in a Protestant alliance against the king. In one diplomatic masterstroke, Pym had given Parliament the edge. Only 3 months later, Pym was dead. With the alliance now in place, 20,000 Scots crossed the border. Together with the Roundheads, they overwhelmed the Cavaliers in the northeast and surged forward to York. In a desperate rearguard action, the king's troops razed every building to the ground and scorched the earth surrounding York before retreating behind the city walls.
As the Roundheads began mining York's city walls, Charles sent Rupert an urgent message. "If York be lost, I shall esteem my crown a little less. Immediately march with all your force to the relief of York." Charles specifically didn't want another major military engagement with the Roundheads. He just wanted to secure this strategically vital city of York. But Rupert was impetuous and hungry for battle. He was also keen to meet someone, a brilliant Roundhead cavalry commander who'd beaten the Royalists time and again. As Rupert set up camp for the night outside the city walls, he asked, "Is Cromwell here?"
They were to meet at the largest battle of the Civil War. For a free study guide about the Civil War and listings of other Open University programmes, you can visit our website at open2.net/Civil War or call us on 0870 900 0312.